Hello, everyone. I am Dakota Bastanzi. I am in the English 1102 online, and I chose to do my argumentative paper or my research topic on is capital punishment a justified solution to fighting crime? So I actually have the stance to the opposition. I do not believe it is justified, and that's what we're going to go over in the slideshow, as well as the arguments from the proponents. So the first thing I think is important to go over is the crimes that are punishable by death. So, what are capital crimes? Um, it's important to know that there's actually 41 of them. So, I think a lot of times when we think of the death penalty, we're thinking that, oh, these are people who actually committed murder, but not all of them do involve murder. So, just a list of some of them: espionage, which is spying on the government, treason as well. So, over trying to overthrow the government, those are things that can be considered as capital crimes punishable by death. Um, and there's also a lot of crimes that include murder as a byproduct of other crimes. So, if there was a civil rights offense where you discriminated against someone and it resulted in their death, that could be punishable using the death penalty. If you were smuggling illegal aliens into like our country and someone died as a result, and I some interesting ones that I looked up as well were death resulting from transporting explosives. So if it blew up a government building or something like that, or someone got injured and died as a result, or just the willful wrecking of a train and that cause death, all of those things can be punishable by the death penalty. And I just think that just leads into just a good foundation, an overview of what we're talking about as we get into the arguments surrounding the death penalty and into the ethical standpoints that we'll be discussing later. Another important thing that I think we should go over is the history of capital punishment, as it really leads into like why capital punishment existed, like why it exists today. So it dated back to the 18th century BCE. That's the earliest known executions. And during that time, it was prevalent in ancient Babylon under the Hammurabi Code. So, if you don't know what that is, it's actually a long list of laws, and many of them could be punishable by death. One such law that I looked up was that if you accuse someone um, for something, for a crime they committed, then they would be tossed into a river. And if they drowned, then they were guilty. But if they made it out, then you would be punished to death for accusing them and them not being guilty. So there's a little things in there that would seem a little bit more crazy in the time period that we're in today. Um, and then the death penalty gained more recognition in 621 BCE. That was during the Draconian Code in Greece. And it's really where capital punishment became known for its severity. And they had numerous crimes that were punishable by death then as well. Um, so, in my research, I found that capital punishment was often referred to as like a prison system of the past. It was often used as a measure to just control the masses and to really give them a sense of this is right or this is wrong. Um, and it was often publicly displayed. So, if you think about times like the French Revolution that we just did a paper on, the guillotine beheadings were done right out in public. If you look back to uh, gladiator fights that we, all know about, I'm sure there's like many movies on that as well. Um, Gladiator fights, like often the public would come from all over to see these executions take place. And they were often used as a form of entertainment, and also known to be quoted as box office hits. So it allowed, you know, part of it can be seen as like here it is for entertainment, which kind of makes it questionable, morality and ethical wise. But proponents would say that it allowed the public to bear witness to crimes committed. It allowed them to see the truth in the matter, and that they could see a stance of like, this person committed this, you can see it to be true, and this is what happens when you enact, like when you carry out certain crimes. Um, it served its purpose, like historically speaking, it served its purpose for that time period, but it appeared to appeal to vengeance. Um, and nowadays, we do have some sentencing that is publicly displayed. It's just not as more widely um, known. It's smaller groups of people that are like bearing witness that either the person being executed wants to like have them brought in on, or approved officials to be in during those executions. So, questions to ask in regards to history. Are there any punishments today that could rival executions of the past? So, is it still needed? If this was something that was historically put into place because of a lack of a prison system, or like lack of like full enforcement, that we have today with our police force and our government, um, is it still needed? So one of the things I found in my research that was that life in prison actually has similar effects on lowering the murder rates as the death penalty does. So I would say that that would be a really like worthy adversary to capital punishment. Like if we can keep these people in the prison system, um, they're really not getting any more joy out of life, so to speak, as they are having to live out their days in confinement. Um, and then, does history make a punishment justified? I would say no. I really truly believe, I know I've brought this point up like probably a few times now, but it served its purpose back then in, controlling the masses and giving a sense of what's right and wrong, what crimes would, will not be tolerated. But with our current system and how we've evolved as a society, um, it just doesn't appear to be as justified today. And considering that we could enact life in prison and it would be just as effectual, it doesn't make it that justified based on a standpoint of history alone. So, evolution and laws. I looked up a few things because I know typically it'll be argued like, what do our laws stand for? What do our laws allow? Um, so the US Constitution, the amendments in the US Constitution and our Bill of Rights can kind of be argued for or against. The Fifth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment kind of couples with the Sixth Amendment, as the Fifth Amendment basically says that people should still have their legal rights until basically found to be guilty. They have to be given due process first. So you have to treat them respectfully and with all of their rights until that due process is over. So I think that's really where the Sixth Amendment's like fair trial comes into play, and like the innocent until proven guilty. Um, the Eighth Amendment prohibits cruel and unusual punishments. So this is where we're in a little bit of a gray area, argumentative wise. So those for the death penalty would argue that it's not cruel and unusual if you can give a more humane punishment, which we'll get into in a moment. Um, and though, like, so, but personally being against it, it does say it shouldn't, we don't allow cruel and unusual punishments. Now, looking at sort of the evolution of where we've come with the death penalty, it just further leads into like either support, or against those amendment arguments, and just for humaneness. So, the ancient times, in the ancient times, it was more of what you would say like barbaric, types of punishments that were enacted, when people were sentenced to death. So crucifixion is just a really well-known one. Even biblically speaking, crucifixion was often advocated for. Um, Beheading, so the guillotine, or even just like them using an axe. And then there was public stoning, like everyone pick up a stone and actually like cast them at the person who is guilty. Um, and then it kind of evolved more into hanging, the gas chamber. The gas chamber is actually used as one of the methods. I thought that that was interesting. And the electric chair. But today's primary method is, lethal injection. It seems to be more widely accepted. Proponents are often going to argue for the humaneness of lethal injection and how it's more like a medical procedure. It's peaceful. They're not getting the same torture or punishment that they inflicted on those whom they did murder. Um, so that's where we're at with evolution and laws. But I think a part with the evolution and laws, that can be called into question, is that we're saying that taking a life is severe punishment. Like it's something severe that is done to be punished. Um, but we're the proponents are you would have to argue that the punishment is also not cruel in that sense, is like if we're saying that taking a life is in fact something severe, um, then wouldn't also the punishment be severe? So that's just something to think about. um, in addition to like the argument for humaneness, well, as for the opposition of that argument, often mechanical failures come into play. So I have a few, statistics here. 6 out of 8 lethal injections in California were administered incorrectly. That's 75%. So, and what happens in lethal injection is that, 3 different drugs are administered, and they're supposed to be administered in a certain order at a certain time. Um, but what happened in those cases is that the paralytic agent was actually given before, um, the person had stopped breathing. So these people had stopped breathing. And what happens as a result is that they actually suffocate, because they're paralyzed. So it just leads into, are these people being tortured by this? Like, is it really that humane? If there's complications that are going to arise. In addition to that, there were 276 known executions with complications between 1890 and 2010. Um, and just looking back, like the types of punishments we had hangings, we have um, the electric chair, we use firing squad. So with hangings, it's really common that not all the times did um, the prisoner's neck break upon the impact of like the hanging. So that's one thing. So then there again, suffocating. And then with a firing squad, if they miss their targets, that person's just suffering as well. Um, and then there, with the use of the electrical chair, there's actually been known for fires to break out and to set that prisoner on fire. Um, so I have a quote down at the bottom that I just thought was just sets the tone for these mechanical failures. And the argument against humanity. So this was from Robert Butterworth. He was a former Florida general attorney. And he said this after there was a electrical chair mishap that resulted in a fire in Florida. So he says that people who wish to commit murder, they better not do it in the state of Florida because we may have a problem with our electric chair. Um, it just really brings into question on if we are as a society are going to address these issues or if we're further looking for vengeance or a form of entertainment that we often saw historically speaking. And just with that vengeance, like if we're doing it out of vengeance and not, you know, because of the ethicalness of it, it just brings into question really the justification for capital punishment, and it just invalidates that claim for humaneness. So, um, up next is the proponent's ethical standpoints. There's two major ethical standpoints that I found for the proponent's claims. One being an exchange of life. So that's kind of like the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth argument that we often hear. Like, you know, if you do this to me, I should be able to do this back. Um, and so they're calling into justification as like the punishment matches that crime. And I think a big thing for the exchange of life argument is just that they argue that people could be saved. So people that could have been killed will not killed. So it's protecting those possible murders, like the people that would have possibly been victim of a murder. And they feel it's not the same as innocent murdering an innocent person. So in that sense, like, you know, we're not murdering the innocent, we're murdering someone guilty. So it should be called for. Um, it's almost like they're weeding out the risk factor. If something in our society is harmful to humans, then it should be dealt with. So that covers that exchange of life argument. The other theory is the theory of just desserts. It basically just means it's similar to the you did the crime, you do the time, only in this sense you're like you killed someone, so now you are going to in turn be killed. Um, it, it basically just means like you deserve what you did. So it's just calling into justification based on like it's deserved. So now we'll go over the opposition to the proponent's ethical standpoints and just information that I've found that kind of just debunks some of the ethical arguments for the proponent. Um, it really, with this first sense, is that it does have a potential to harm innocent lives. So I have a few statistics and then I'm going to kind of, you know, weigh those. In a 31 year span, there were 98 people on death row who were exonerated because they were actually innocent. Um, And then between 1900 and 1990, 416 documented cases of false convictions were found. And that's only ones that like are documented. These aren't cases that like, this isn't every case because not every case in those years was documented. Um, and there's known issues with the court system and sentencing procedures. So, in looking at that, those arguments, it almost appears like we're weighing statistical lives. So we're weighing between the statistical lives that could be killed by a criminal, but we're also weighing those who could innocently be convicted and put to death. And I think that just really calls into question, like, is this moral? Like, should we be for something that could potentially, like, where we're weighing human lives on either side of the scale, and we could potentially be sentencing the wrong person. It doesn't really give any time for them to be exonerated if they're put to death, where life in prison would. Someone would be able to fight their case and maybe have time to come up with the evidence to prove their innocence. But there's an irreversibility of death that, doesn't really give time for those innocently convicted. Um, and it really calls into question, like, is there a greater need for retribution? Um, are we so willing as a society, or are we so needing as a society to see someone punished that we don't care who's punished? Is it, do we want to see the right life being punished or just any life being punished? So it determines guilt of future crimes not yet committed. I just really think like so innocent until proven guilty is something that we've all been ingrained with, but we're not really giving them that benefit of the doubt if we're saying, oh, you did this one murder, you're going to potentially commit so many more. I just need to back to the court system, the known sentencing. I kind of skipped over that. Um, but in with the court system, there is just bias that comes into play, which we will be discussing in future slides. A push for a speedy trial, and just a push to see that person be punished. Like everything's so sped up, limited resources are put into play. There's opposition to DNA testing. It's more like, let's get this over with. And I really believe that that's what leads to innocent people being convicted. Um, and then with the exchange argument, it's argued that it cannot be evenly applied. So this goes back to what is punishable by death. So there are, remember, capital crimes that do not involve murder. So if we're going to say, okay, it's an eye for an eye, or a life for life in this instant, then we're like, how do you apply that in other situations? So if someone like with espionage, if the morality is based on, it's an even trade or an even exchange, how would you justify espionage? So spying or treason. Um, I think one example I used in my paper was like for an arsonist. So if we're applying this evenly for murder, then how would you apply it evenly for an arsonist? We don't go out and like set their house on fire um, just because they, set another building on fire. So they aren't punished in that same way. It can't be evenly applied to all crimes across the board, which really just again calls into question, is it necessary? Is it justified? Is it moral? And can it ethically stand? Deterrence of future crimes is probably one of the biggest of the proponents' arguments. So I have statistics, there's results on studies really. So in the 1970s, Isaac Ehrlich's study, thought his was done in the 1970s, and his was probably the most renowned study to date. There's so many articles that I found that just referenced his study. um, for the proponent's claims. And he found that capital punishment deters 8 future murders. There was data that was used later in accordance with his study, that they pulled this data from over 3,000 counties, and they later verified that number to be 18 future murders instead of 8. Um, and then a study between 1960 and 2000 found murder to increase when the death penalty was suspended. Um, and then again in 2003, a study showed that 5 murders were deterred. Um, so that the advocate's claim is that this capital punishment actually does what it's intended to do, which is to deter further crimes. And it is supposed to correct unwanted behavior, so that it puts into play, like, if people understand that there's a consequence of death involved in murdering someone, then they are going to be less likely to murder. So this is about opposition to that deterrence claim. One of the big things is that we need to really question the variables used in that study. I found that the data that was taken in those studies was actually data from the FBI. The FBI's main purpose, like one of their jobs, is to prevent crime. So it just really calls into question, like, is their bias taken into play if they are um, a government entity that is supposed to be stopping crime, preventing crime? Could their data be skewed um, to show that the death penalty does prevent crime? Um, and then it's just really hard to measure the probability of future killings or deterrence, because humans are not always rational. We don't always think things through. It's we don't sit here and weigh the consequences of our actions before we take them in certain situations. So it really just calls into question, like, how, if someone's not rationally thinking, if they're not of sound mind, maybe they have a mental illness, are they really going to be deterred by the consequences because they're probably not thinking about those consequences? In addition to that, how do you measure someone who thought about killing but didn't? How would they know that this group of people were thinking about murdering someone and thought, oh no, I don't, the death penalty is in place, so I don't want that. Um, it's just really hard to measure those probabilities. And I think another big thing is that all those studies differ. Um, we couldn't even pinpoint if it was 8, 18, or 5 murders. Each one had different results when they looked at it. And I believe they used like correlation data. So they were kind of taking that data and using certain models and stuff like that to see if there was an increase or not. So there was some data manipulation going on. Um, and then there's other factors that could lead to a decrease or increase in murder. You have to take into account the economy. Where we are, where are we pulling this data from? Is there higher poverty levels? Is there higher drug use? Because those things do affect the level of crime in those areas. And there was a study done based on economic data and geographical data. In that study, the studies that they did were so varied with the results. Some of these studies would show that there are hundreds of lives saved, and other ones that, like, as they were pulling these factors together from different areas, showed that there was actually like a negative of lives saved. So there's like lives actually lost. So the murder actually increased in some areas. So you really have to question, is capital punishment the reason behind the deterrence, or is there something else that is affecting that deterrence? And this is just a continuation on the opposition to that, the claim for deterrence. Um, Is it meant to deter only certain groups? Historically speaking, if you look at historically and statistically speaking, if you look at who is often punished for these crimes, it's unevenly applied. There's so much discrimination and bias that has to be taken into consideration. And it's often when you look at who is being punished, it's often either poor people or people of color. So the poor, you're looking at limited resources. They don't have enough money for a good defense. They are often stuck with someone, so they have someone appointed to them if they can't afford their own defense. And sometimes the person appointed to them has no knowledge of capital cases. So they really aren't getting a fair start or a fair trial, so to speak. And then with people of color, they just aren't given the same credibility as white defendants. So African American males are more likely to actually receive um, the death sentence. Um, and when we look at who are more likely to get stuck with this sentencing, there's more retribution, there's more push for the death penalty when the victims are white or the victims are from the police force or government. There was a study done between 1930 and 1984 that found that more than half of those sentenced to death were Black. And then it was even like a higher chance of being sentenced to death if you were a Black male who committed crimes against a white victim or a member of like the police force. And I just really think that, with those biases, and it's not just that, there's racial profiling and stereotyping that comes into play with jury's decisions. Um, and I know with the jury, if anyone's ever been like for jury selection or called for jury duty, the defense and the opposition both try to weed out those biases. But of course, like they still have a job to do to either prove innocence or guilt. So those biases still creep in and they're not being addressed. So if you have people on a jury who are looking at defendants and saying, oh, well, they're guilty because of the color of their skin, or, I just don't like the way they look, or, they're poor, so they must be on drugs. It's that type of discrimination that creeps in and leads to the death penalty being given unevenly. Um, and I just think it really calls into question on, is this an okay form of punishment if these issues aren't being addressed? So, we as a society are allowing it to this to happen. So at the bottom, I have this quote. It was by Michael Maslin. He had this cartoon that he posted in New York, um, and it was essentially a cartoon of someone giving the final verdict from the jury. And that verdict was, we find that all of us as a society are to blame, but only the defendant is guilty. And I think that just really calls into question, like we're seeing this over and over. We as a society are to blame for these people getting pushed and like punished with the death penalty or innocently convicted, wrongfully convicted. Um, but we're not doing anything to fix the court system. We're not doing anything to fix our methods that we are inflicting capital punishment with. We're just accepting them. And I think that really calls into question the justification because these people are human beings and we are treating them as less than based on thoughts of, who they are based on the way they look or the way they act. So, in conclusion, I believe that capital punishment is not justified because there are other efficient methods. So, again, life in prison, if it's found to be just as effectual, then I really think that there's no reason for capital punishment anymore. It may have served its purpose in history to, work as a control for the masses. But now that we do have that prison system in place and we have other measures, I feel that we should be using them. And then also mechanical court system failures, those botched executions that happen that no one's addressing, or just racial biases that come in or stereotypes that aren't being addressed, just make it further unjustified as it's not being applied across the board. And then looking back at the ethical and statistical inadequacies, the data can really be debated on, was there controlled variables? Is it actually like an unbiased study that was created? And again, human biases. Just as when people are being sentenced to death, they do go before a jury of their peers. And not all the time can people set aside those biases in the process of conviction, which just leads to innocents being convicted. And that is all for my presentation. I just have my works cited in here, all the sources that I use. So this is my first works cited page. Here's my next works cited page. I had like 15 sources that I pulled from. Um, and here is my last. So thank you all for listening. And I really appreciate you taking the time just to hear me out on why I feel that capital punishment is not a justified solution that should be enacted to fight crime.